This episode is brought to you by Progressive, where drivers who save by switching save nearly $750 on average. Quote now at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates, national average 12-month savings of $744 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2022 and May 2023. Potential savings will vary. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, March 13th, 9 days after he took office in March of 1933, Franklin Roosevelt asked Congress to amend existing federal prohibition policy to allow for the sale and consumption of 3.2% alcohol beer. In his order, he says, quote, "I recommend to Congress the passage of legislation for the immediate modification of the Volstead Act. I deem action at this time to be of the highest importance." And so let me repeat that. 9 days after FDR takes office, in the heart of the Great Depression, this is what he is saying is of the highest importance. We need 3.2% beer. So I'm curious why he was focusing on this, and maybe does it have something to do with the fact that St. Patrick's Day is just around the corner here on March 14th? I don't know. Let's find out. Here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
That's my theory. I'm sticking to it. That he got someone was like, look, we always throw a White House St. Patrick's Day party. It's like way funner with beer.
We have all this green dye.
Yep. You're president now. You know, maybe we could get a little 3.2 in here. But actually, that's not the reason. There is actually a pretty interesting and legit reason. But why is this like 9 days in? I'm sure there's a lot on his plate or a lot in his mug, so to speak. Why is he focusing on this?
Is your theory that he was drunk?
Oh, no. I would never say that about
yeah, look, first of all, it was a big campaign promise. We talked just a few episodes ago about FDR and the coalition that he was building on the back of Al Smith at his 1928 campaign. And one of the big parts of that coalition were immigrants and wets and people who really wanted to see alcohol re-legalized in the United States. And this is an easy campaign promise to make good on. He can lobby Congress to pass this legislation. The legislation had been introduced many times over the previous 10 years. So it was just, getting the ball rolling on something that people really, really wanted. And particularly his constituency really, really wanted.
I mean, this reminds me a lot of the pandemic when, shortly after the pandemic, we made, liquor stores essential businesses. It's like, you can't get to the mall, but the liquor store, that's open. You know what I mean? It's so funny to me how, during times of, depression and when things are really bad, people are like, we need booze. And the taxes associated with that booze is what's really going to be, I think, a motivator for the federal government to be able to put a tax on this, get businesses to hire more people, and to get money rolling in. Yeah,
I mean, the economic element of this is huge, and I think is probably an easier lever to pull than a lot of the other kind of underlying New Deal-esque economic programs that would take a long time. But this is kind of, you repeal this, you kind of people are going to show up and start spending that and spending money, the little that they have on the alcohol. By the way, one just little aside to what you were saying, Nikki, we've been looking at some of the buttons that have been that were made for this campaign, 1932 campaign. Roosevelt and repeal, and a Roosevelt button with a big mug of beer next to it. They're really delightful campaign ephemera. But
I have, and I don't know that it's actually from the era, but I have a prohibition repeal pint glass that has an elephant and a donkey clinking beer glasses and uniting over repeal. So I do think that the historic paraphernalia around repeal is excellent, especially because you can tell it's just people wanted to drink. And that is the expression in all of these little pieces of campaign paraphernalia. And I appreciate that.
I'm here for it. I wish it was a wine glass. I'm more of a wino than I am a booze drinker, but I will take it.
And it is interesting to see how the argument for repeal evolves and is framed. And so during his campaign, Roosevelt uses language like, we have on our side a definite method of relief in the true American tradition, with the states authorized to carry out their part and responsibility. And we want to give that power back to the states, But there's a framing there as a sort of, it's an individual liberty thing, but also a states' rights thing, but also there's an economic element to this as well. And I think it was a very real big part of why he gets elected. And moreover, I mean, I think there was a sort of personal angle here. By all accounts, Roosevelt never really acted as if prohibition existed. Nope. He just kept on partying the way that a lot of people did. So there's that.
I think there is something interesting about that anti-prohibition argument, though. It was an argument against government getting too big. This idea that, yes, and Roosevelt talks about this too. He's like, temperance is good. We should drink in moderation, and we should have these virtues and these values. But if it's enforced by a large federal government, it is going to go bad very quickly. And it does, because people just break the law, and then you need this larger law enforcement apparatus, and it breaks down trust in the government. And yet, Roosevelt is about to embark on the largest expansion of government in U.S. history. And so it's interesting that there are these two almost competing arguments that are running through this.
Yeah. That's a really good point, Nikki. I think about, too, just how, like, when you outlaw something, you push it underground.
Yeah.
And sort of all of the sort of black market businesses that were pushing their own alcohol and really, leading to other sort of criminal activity. It was one way I think that the government could sort of recoup some of those underground markets and money that's being made, millions of dollars that are being made, sort of bring it out into the light of the day and say, like, okay, we're going to roll this back.
Yeah, and take advantage of that. I mean, the economy around alcohol did not go anywhere. It just became something that the government could no longer tax and, get a piece of. And so, yes, I think there was a decade, basically, of people watching, like, oh, where's all this money is just sort of sloshing around without us getting part of it at a moment of real economic crisis.
It's a high-stakes election year, so it's not enough to just follow along. You need to understand what's happening so you are fully informed come November. Every weekday on the NPR Politics Podcast, our political reporters break down important stories and backstories from the campaign trail so you understand why it matters to you. Listen to the NPR Politics Podcast wherever you get your podcasts.
The evolution, I mean, you've used the phrase wet a couple times, Nikki, and obviously there's dry. Roosevelt, in 1928 tried to use the word damp a little bit to describe his position. I mean, it's...
he was really more of a moist.
Yeah.
Think about it.
Not really a stump speech material there. But yeah, people are calibrating and finding middle ground and sort of aligning a little bit and, moving this away from, I think, the initial sort of real moral argument where, it doesn't matter what percentage alcohol it is. It's alcohol, and we have a moral objection to that. And so, but it does come down to sort of some of this parsing in this way. Like in this moment, we mentioned this 3.2% alcohol line for beer. So, that becomes the proposal. And this act basically says that it would, because the Volstead Act, it defines alcoholic beverages and has a little bit of like, I think it's anything more than 0.5% alcohol counts as intoxicating. And so then what they do here is they reframe it as, well, 3.2% is non-intoxicating beverage. And so it does not qualify for the existing laws. There's a carve out. 3.2% isn't super high, but I don't know. I've gotten buzzed on a 3 or 4% beer. I mean, I can't really handle anything more than that at this point.
I mean, I know this isn't necessarily the point, but this is actually really interesting as we think about amendments and enacting legislation, which has been a big topic of conversation around other legislation recently. And the Volstead Act is super interesting because we passed an amendment that said we're banning alcoholic beverages, but it didn't define what an alcoholic beverage was. So you needed an act of legislation that would define an alcoholic beverage. And so this becomes the back door for kind of rewriting the amendment or redefining the amendment in certain ways before it could be repealed. And I just think that's a really interesting example of that mechanism of the relationship between an amendment and enacting legislation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I also think it's fascinating that, like, once that legislation is passed, it's like, let's go, boys.
Oh, yeah.
Look, the barrels were already there, ready to be rolled out.
Everyone was like, we're ready.
I'm like, where did this beer
ready
come
at the
from?
starting line. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's a brewery in Milwaukee that within 2 days of this bill passing on March, so the bill passes on March 22nd, so not long after it gets proposed. They do miss St. Patrick's Day, though. But the bill passes on March 22nd. Within 2 days, a brewery in Milwaukee hires 600 workers. There's plants all over the country, like spending millions of dollars refurbishing their plants and bringing in new workers. Then the taps finally open for this level of beer in early April, and brewers within 48 hours are paying what is the equivalent of today $155 million in taxes, in the first 48 hours. It is so resonant of what happened when legalized marijuana happened in New York City and in other parts of the country. But, there were just immediately just all of this extra tax revenue in the coffers.
It solves so many problems. It gets rid of the black market. It tamps down on organized crime. It stops making people into lawbreakers for doing something that everybody does anyway. Like, it makes so much sense.
Yeah. Though, our country's relationship with alcohol didn't exactly end up at a good place. And I think a lot of those sort of a lot of those fundamental questions that the temperance movement was asking still linger. But yes, the question is, this is not the way to solve and address those questions. Before we wrap up, I did go a little bit down this path of the 3.2% because I think there's always been this idea, and they say it about weed and they say it about alcohol as well, that it was like a lot weaker back then. And so, you see people like drinking tons in the Old West and so forth. I think largely that's true, but like there's this myth that like in the Middle Ages, alcohol was basically water and it was like people would drink it because it was slightly more sanitary than water. But like now there's research that shows that kind of like there was like 6% alcohol back in, the Middle Ages. And certainly I think by this point, you could buy strong beer. And so I think 3.2% is an interesting line here. It's not like that was the strongest beer around. There was probably stronger beer, and they were finding a kind of like pretty light beer now is what, like 4% or something? Yeah. So, this is what would they would call this a session ale now, right? The 3.2%.
A very light session ale.
Yeah.
It depends on, too, how much does the drink cost? How much are you drinking?
Yes.
Like, are you getting one beer or are you getting 6?
Yes.
Like, makes a difference.
Yeah, for sure. Let's leave it there, but let's wrap up as we often do with some also on this day's other things that happened on March 14th.
So in 1794, Eli Whitney received a patent for his cotton gin, an invention that revolutionized America's cotton industry. And that's not wrong. The cotton gin transformed the United States and the institution of slavery forever.
That's what I was thinking too, Kellie, that it doesn't just transform the cotton industry, but the whole system of enslavement is revolutionized by it.
And, I think obviously a huge momentous occurrence, but for whatever reason, maybe it was just my middle school education, but Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin was like the prototypical like 6th grade historical fact. I don't know why. It's just like lodged in my head. And I remember at a time like not really understanding the real implications of it and just being like, so this is what I do in school. I just have to hold this piece of information in my head that Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. Okay. Like moving on.
It's that for me and Thomas Jefferson and the Louisiana Purchase. I feel like stays cemented in my mind.
Yeah.
Yep. And on this day in 1951, during the Korean War, United Nations forces recapture Seoul as part of Operation Ripper, also known as the Fourth Battle of Seoul.
We have done very few, if any, episodes on the Korean War.
I was about to say. Yeah, because this is the US v. China, really, by 1951, which is worth it diving into.
Yeah. And then in 1962, this is the day that Edward Kennedy officially launches his ultimately successful candidacy for U.S. Senate, and then he would hold that seat for some 47 years until very recently. So there you go. All right. Well, as always, we were talking about some of this stuff in our newsletter. You can go sign up for that at our website, thisdaypod.com. But we will leave it there. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
It is, as you may have heard, an election year. But do you feel like you have a lot of choices? Here are the new candidates, same as the old candidates. How did we get here again? The fact is, our democracy is broken. We can all feel it, and there's data to back it up, too. A Princeton University study found that public opinion has near zero impact on what laws are passed. You know what does have an impact, though? Money. You can call it lobbying, you can call it super PAC spending, you can call it corruption. But luckily, there are things we can do right now to fix this broken system. This podcast is part of the Pro-Democracy Podcast Coalition, a group that's banding together to make our democracy better. We're working with Represent Us, the largest grassroots organization fighting to end corruption city by city and state by state. You can join the movement too. Go to represent.us/podcast to find out more.
Radiotopia. From